we'll begin with the issue of eating in the sukkah the first night when it's raining, or even if it's not raining. So the sukkah basically discusses it in Sukkah Daf Chav Zayin, Chav Hey, the Mishnah over there. It talks about the obligation of eating in the sukkah. The Torah tells us by sukkahs teshvu shivas yomim. That you sit in the sukkah 7 days, and the Gemara has the famous drasha, teshvu kein tadiru. You have to dwell in the sukkah the way you'd live in your house. So that's why built into that obligation is the heter, the leniency of mitztayer, someone who's uncomfortable, whether it's yardu geshamim, whether it's raining, whether it's you're in a warm climate like California or Florida, it's too hot, or Israel, or is it too cold? As we all know, if you have a leak in your room, in your dining room, you're going to move into the kitchen. So if it's raining outside, you're going to move inside. So it's a general halacha. Again, there'll be a certain element of subjectivity, and in terms of, I guess, what the norm is, etc. Different people are going to be mitzvah on different things. But there's some objective standard as well in terms of the rain and all that. But they point out that there are different leniencies, and one is mitzvah, that since since it's not just to sit, but it's to dwell, so it's the same dinam as living in the home. So they point out, so how does that impact the first night, if anything? Because the Gemara as well over there goes into there's a special Gzera Shava that the Gemara makes between Sukkah and Matzah. That the Gemara tells us, the Torah tells us 7 days a week, Shiva Shamim Tochal Matzah, 7 days Yechayev to eat Matzah the whole Pesach. And yet we have another pasuk, Be'erev Tochul Matzos. So which one is it? So the Gemara answers that really the 7 days a week, it's a rishus. If you want to eat, meaning it means to say you can't eat bread, that if you want to eat, you have to eat matzah. But the first night of Pesach, you have no option. Even if you don't want to eat matzah, you have to eat matzah. So Erev Tochul Matzos is teaching me a chiyuv, and the 7 days a week is teaching me a rishus. So too by Sukkot, it says you have to eat in the Sukkot. The whole discussion in the Gemara, Rabbi Lezer, the Chachamim, you have to eat 14 meals in the Sukkah, because 7 times 2 meals for Sudas Yantiv. And yet the Gemara learns out from Tesvav, there's a special obligation to eat in the Sukkah the night of Pesach. So, and also this parenthetically, when the Gemara says rishus doesn't always mean optional. Rishus can mean lower level obligation, i.e. the Tosas and Brachas on Daf Chavav at the beginning of the 4th perek, when we say Tfilas Arv is rishus. It's a machlokas in the Gemara, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Gamliel, whether Ma'ariv is mandatory or optional. We'll discuss why Yaakov Avinu's tefillah was discriminated against in a later shir. But Tfilas Arv, that's the way we paskin, Tfilas Arv is rishus. So the question is, so Tosas over there point out rishus doesn't mean optional. Doesn't mean you have a choice to daven. Of course you have to daven Ma'ariv, but it means lower level obligation. If you have a mitzvah overis, Tosas' example is, if you have a mitzvah overis, you have something else more important to take care of. But not that, okay, let's go see, should I daven Ma'ariv or watch the playoff game? I don't know, it's a tough decision. But in terms of, so that's not a choice. The choice is when you have another pressing mitzvah, so that's what you have to do. So this parent, but others, so rishus doesn't really mean rishus. Mm-hmm. But even if we learn that rishus doesn't mean rishus, so the Gemara wants to know, the Rishonim asks, but I don't get it. What do you mean it's a rishus? We know there's halacha for Simchas Yantiv Suda. You have to eat you have to eat a Suda on Sukkot because Sukkot is Yantiv. So, and then plus we know we have a chiyuv to eat the meals in the sukkah on Sukkot. So what do you mean you only have to eat one meal So what does that mean? Tetzvav, tetzvav. So what's special? The question is something. The Gemara is telling me there's something special about the first night of Sukkot. But what is it? L'chorah, you should have to eat in the Sukkah every meal, and you have to eat a meal because. So someone would say, yes, technically speaking, it's a pure technical issue. In Achinami, you're right. Out the din of Sukkah, Yechaya be'erev tochu matzos, but out, bottom line, you'll have to eat in the Sukkah anyway, out simply, maybe you can find some nafkamina here or there, but bottom line is somebody should say, you're right, there's no real practical difference. Right. However, other Rishonim say, no, there's a big difference. That's what I touched on tonight. Tos's opinion in Brachas, I think it's Memtes, that Tosas points out that no, I'll tell you what the Chiddush is. That normally there's halacha of mitzvah pater min sukkah. That if it's raining, yardu geshamim, you're exempt from eating in the sukkah. So we'll see exempt or usher, but exempt from eating in the sukkah. So they point out that that's only the rest of sukkahs. But Tosas says, Lailo Rishona, if you start the meal and it's raining, so normally if you start the meal it's raining, let's say on Chol Hamoed or even Thursday lunch, it's even Yantif. So that's why a lot of people, when it's raining, they want to start the meal quickly. I'm not saying one should have that attitude, because then technically speaking, again, the fact that you don't have to go back in the sukkah doesn't mean you shouldn't. Because I was at usually if you're not eating in your own house or your own sukkah, you don't really have the option. One time I was away, I was eating in someone else's. The irony was I was eating in someone's sukkah. So there's two parts to me. Obviously, one part I like eating in the house because it's more comfy. Because on the other hand, I want to be eating in the sukkah. So I was in the house for the Baal Bus. I knew he didn't really want to eat outside. He wanted to eat. But his father-in-law was there who wanted to eat in the sukkah. So I think it was a case where it was like raining in the beginning, but basically it stopped, and even the sun came out. So basically the father-in-law was asking, so should we go back in the sukkah? So I didn't know, so I had to work it out, because I knew the son-in-law didn't want to go back in. But the bottom line is, technically speaking, the son-in-law was right. You don't have to go back, and there's no chiyuv to go back in the sukkah, but doesn't mean you shouldn't go back. It's definitely praiseworthy if it gets nice outside and it stops dripping and all that, then why not go back? Right. But you're not obligated. It is true. However, the Lailo Rishona, if it begins raining, you eat inside. But if it stops raining, you don't have an option. It's not this praiseworthy to go back. You chayav to go outside and eat in the sukkah.
If it stops raining.
Yeah, if it stops raining, so you chayav to go out and eat. I guess you make a leishe basuk, and you have to eat a kabeya of challah. So according to that, Tosas, you know what the chiddush is of tetzvav? Just like layout by matzah, be'erev tochul matzos is a chiyuv. What the Gemara is telling me is that normally a mitzvah is patim in that sukkah, and therefore normally when it rains, so then once it goes by hascholas hasuda, and I'd be exempt from going back even if that's a tirka maybe to go back in. But the first night, we're not worried about it. You have to go. If it stops raining, you're chayav to go back in the sukkah. Not that if you want to, you can. You'd have to go back and make a leishe basukah. You had a question?
The difference is just based on if it stops raining. That if it stops raining,
according to Tosas, according to Tosas,
it means even on the first day, Tosas will say you should go inside if it's
correct. According to Tosas, if it starts raining, it doesn't. If it's scattered showers, that's where Tosas comes in. But if it's pouring, according to Tosas, you never go into the sukkah.
Right.
According to not the way we pass them, but according to Tosas, if it's raining, you don't eat in the sukkah. We're going to get into why shortly, but let me just get you the shittas down first. That's Tosfos. That's Tos. The chiddush is be'erev tetzvav, that even though you started the meal in the house, behetera, but you chayav to go back out when and if it stops raining, and that's the difference. All other days, even if it stops raining, you don't have to go back out. That's how the first night of Sukkot, and presumably the second night as well, is different. That's what Tosfos says. The Ran has a different answer to that question. The Ran says, you know what the Chiddush of Tezvav is teaching me? The Chiddush is that what's the amount of one, what's the Isser, the Gemara tells us that we learn about Teishvuk Ein Tadiru, that you have to make your Kriyas in the Sukkah. And we say that sleep is even more stricter than eating. Sleeping, even a Shinas Arai, you have to sleep outside, but Achilas Arai, eating chips and that kind of stuff, is okay to eat outside the Sukkah. It might be praiseworthy. We'll get into the practice of two different rabbis in the Mishnah and Sukkah. We'll get into it later. It's praiseworthy, but you're not obligated to eat in the Sukkah for... So what's the shear? So the shear is, as long as you're eating less than a kabeya, it's not considered a kriyas, and therefore, technically speaking, you can eat outside the Sukkah if it's less than a kabeya. So comes along the Ran and says, I'll tell you what the Chiddush is. Really, in theory, I only have to eat a kazayas for my obligation on Sudas Yantiv. So really, I can eat. I don't have to go in the sukkah. I can eat my meals al tzchi of Sudas Yantiv inside. I'll eat a kazayas, and therefore I'm not violating the kabeya. And therefore, the question is, why do I need a special pasuk to tell me? In other words, if I have to eat in the sukkah anyway, out Simchas Yantiv, so why do I need a special pasuk to tell me the first night? So the Ran writes, technically speaking, the other days you can fulfill your mitzvah of Simchas Yantiv without eating in the sukkah, because you can eat. But the Chiddush is the first night of Sukkot, you have to, since Tezvav, the Torah requires you to eat in the sukkah. So actually within the Ran, there's a discussion among the Achronim, what's the pshat in the Ran? Is he saying, hence the first night it's chiyuv to eat a kabeya in the sukkah? But no, he's saying the Chiddush is, since the Torah requires a kazayas, so that becomes choshev, and therefore, so the shayla within the Ran is, because the Ran says you have to eat the first night in the sukkah. Is he saying that even, you still only have to eat a kazayas, except the Chiddush of Tesla is telling me even that kazayis has to be eaten in the sukkah? Or no, that the din takes on, that since you have to eat in the sukkah the first night, that means you have to eat a share kabeya. So he writes, he basically treats it that you need a kabeya, but he says, but I can't say people only the kazayis is nothing to be based on. So he says the kabeya, but he doesn't reject the kazayis. But either way, the Ran says that's why you need the pasuk. And that's why, so he doesn't directly talk about the issue of rain, but we'll see people connect Tosfos with the Ran, that the Ran Shita is that if it's raining, you don't eat in the sukkah. Even though in this we don't necessarily see it from what I just said, but he's just answering up the question of Tosfos differently. But either it's clearly Tosfos, even though I've heard the Ran in different directions. So therefore I'm just throwing out the Ran, but we have the Ran is an interesting answer anyway, in terms of that. So that's Tosfos, and people put the Ran together with Tosfos. And the Rush totally disagrees. The Rush writes, Rabbeinu Asher in Brachas, he points out that one has the chiyuv to eat Tezvav is telling me that all Sukkot's long, if it's raining, Yardu Gusham and Patim in Sukkah. The Chiddush of Tezvav is I'm chayiv to eat in the Sukkah even if it's raining. There's no exemption of a mitztayer on Laila Rishona. That seems to be a machlokas Rishonim. We'll call it Tosfos and the Rush. We'll leave the Ran out of it. Tosfos clearly, or nothing, it's clear, but Tosfos says that obviously if it's raining, you don't eat in the sukkah. And the Rush says if it's raining, you eat in the sukkah. So what's in the Kudas HaMachlokas between Tosfos and the Ran? Why does Tosfos eat Rush? Why does Tosfos eat in this? What's found in Tosfos that you don't eat in the sukkah if it's raining? And what's found in the Rush you do? So some want to say that the Kudas HaMachlokas is as follows: that Tosfos Tosfos and the Ran, whoever say that basically we're working with Teishu Ke'ein Tadiro. That principle applies even on Laila Rishona. And therefore, the same guidelines that apply to the whole Sukkot apply equally to the first night. It's Teishu Ke'ein Tadiro. The first night is the mitzvah of Yeshiva Sukkah, and the same mitzvah Yeshiva as all year, all the whole Sukkot. And therefore, Pashas, it's the same, it's the mitzvah of Yeshiva Sukkah, and therefore you have a heter mitzvah. The only difference is Tosfos would say if it stops raining you have to go out. But in terms of the din of mitzvah, it seems to apply. And the Rush seems to say no. This din of Tetzvah is telling me the Chiddush. It's not just the mitzvah of Yeshiva Sukkah anymore. That's all Sukkahs long. But there's a mitzvah of Achila in the Sukkah. And he says, so obviously the din of Achila, there's no halacha of mitzvah, there's no din of Teishu Ke'ein Tadiro, that's only by the din of Yeshiva Sukkah. So Tosfos holds that the din of Yeshiva, so the normal halacha of mitzvah applies, hence even the first night. According to the Rush, there is no heter mitzvah, we're talking about the mitzvah's Achila. There is no, we're only familiar with the heter mitzvah on the Sukkah's Teishu Shiva Shamim. But the Rush writes, apparently the Chiddush is it's a mitzvah of Achila in the Sukkah. Of course, it has to be in the Sukkah as well, but the primary is Achila, the Yeshiva is secondary, and hence there is no heter of mitzvah. That seems to be where many Achronim learn in the Kuda between Tosfos and the Rush, but more fundamentally whether there's a chiyuv to eat in the Sukkah Laila Rishona, whether it's a heter mitzvah. Interesting, the Gra says it's not the machlokas. The Gra says no, Tosfos does not work with Teishu Ke'ein Tadiru. Because he says, how do I know he doesn't? Because the Vilna Gaon wants to say the exception is the rule. He says we're looking at the other Achronim are looking at it. Well, since according to Tosfos, if it's raining, you don't eat in the Sukkah, so they're focusing on that part. The Gra takes the other part. But what does Tosfos say? If it stops raining, you have to go back. But Mitzvah would exempt me from going. Like the same way, as long as I started my meal with rain, I don't have to go back the rest of Sukkot. So why not? Why should the first night be different? But then the Gra says it's not the heter. It's not working with Mitzvah. It's another issue. It's a din of Yardu Geshamim. And this, by the way, there's a discussion within the Ramah, what is mitzvah? Like, there's different, so that's part of the Nakuda here also. There's a mitzvah of being a Nikiyam HaMitzvah. I'm eating and it's raining outside. Or I'm eating and it's freezing. That's one level of mitzvah. There's another issue of mitzvah. Well, it's going to take me 15 minutes to walk to a sukkah. There's a big difference between classical mitzvah is the one mitzvah b'shas kiyam ha-mitzvah. The fact I have to walk 15 minutes doesn't necessarily whether that's considered mitzvah. Even though in terms of we're saying you don't have to go back in, but that's because at the time of the mitzvah you couldn't. But that's what. Anyway, the Vilna Gaon says it's not working with Teishu Ke'ein Tadiro, or else why the exception to the rule? But then you know why? He says Yardu Geshamim makes it a sukkah pesula. You know why Tosfos says Tosfos really holds you should eat in the sukkah the first night. He doesn't hold, whether he fundamentally agrees, maybe he fundamentally agrees with the Rush. That maybe there is no, heter mitzvah. And really there's a chiyuv to eat in the sukkah even if it rains. The only problem is it's a technical reason, the Gra says. If it's raining, it doesn't have a shame sukkah anymore. Yardu Geshamim. So therefore, according to the way the Gra is going Tosfos, even if I went in the sukkah and ate in the rain, I wouldn't be accomplishing anything. That is, it's like eating in my house. You might as well be dry. If you're eating in your house, whether you're eating in the sukkah or not, the Gra is saying Yardu Geshamim makes it a sukkah pesula. It's not a kosher sukkah anymore. It doesn't have a chal shem sukkah. Let me understand. So let me elaborate on that. In a different context, there's a famous Minchas Chinuch. In a different context, but same Yisod. Famous Rav Chaim. The Gemara asked in Sukkah, The pasuk says, we have a pasuk, Chaga Sukkos Tasa L'cha, and the Gemara learns out in Daf Tes, Lahoti Sukkah Gezula. So we learn out from the pasuk, Chaga Sukkos Tasa L'cha, it has to be your sukkah. Exactly how you can have a stolen sukkah as a separate share. The Gemara goes through trying to put something, maybe it's mechuber l'karka. Gemara goes through that, but it's not our issue now. The Gemara assumes you can. So the pasuk comes to tell me the hote is exula, a sukkah exula is no good. That's the Gemara, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Tosas asks, because the Gemara asked it by lulav how it goes there, but the Tosas, what do we need a pasuk? Lahote is exula. What about the famous principle mitzvah haba ba'avera? A mitzvah is done through an avera is a meaningless activity. So therefore, what do you mean? So what do you need what do I need a pasuk for? Why bring a pasuk if I don't need it? Lamali kras svarahu. What do I need a pasuk for? We know mitzvah ba'avera. That's Tosas kasha. So Tosas in Sukkot Daf Tes says, well, I'll tell you why. Because mitzvah ba'avera is only a psul d'Rabbanan, not a psul d'Oraisa. And therefore I need the pasuk. So therefore Minat Torah it still would be good. So I need the pasuk to tell me even Minat Torah you don't get the mitzvah. That's what Tosas writes in Sukkah. But the Minchas here and others point out it's difficult because Tosas himself in Daf Lamed writes mitzvah ba'avera is a psul d'Oraisa. And that's the way we assume. Pashtus, it is a din d'Oraisa. So getting Sahada Kasha Ladukta, what do we need the pasuk of Chaga Sukkos Tasa L'cha Lahoti Exula? Just tell me mitzvah ba'avera. So that's what the famous Minchas Chinuch says, that there's a big difference, perhaps he suggests, between if someone is sitting in the sukkah and it's a mitzvah ba'avera versus if it was just mitzvah ba'avera, or because we have a pasuk lahoti exul. What's the difference? Either way, he doesn't seem to be getting his mitzvah. But that's what the Minchas Chinuch raises. He says we know clearly there's a mitzvah asay to sit in the sukkah, a mitzvah daraisa, a sukkah's feishu shiva jamim. Let's say one does not sit in the sukkah. Do you merely mevatel a mitzvah asay? Merely, I'm saying, is not to say it's not a big deal, but or even worse, there's an isser asay. Do I say there's an isser to eat chutz l'sukkah? So that's what the Minchas Chinuch clears, and the famous nafkamina by an onain. We know the Mishnah in the beginning of the third parak in Brachas has a Misha Mesu Wafana Patam on a mitzvahs, the din of Aninas. The din of Aninas is really din the right, so that has nothing to do with it. It's really din Rabbanan of Torah mitzvahs. The reason why in Shulchan Aruch they call it Hilchas Aninas, they should call it Hilchas Misha Meis, because Rav Saleh said it was too long to write, so he just wrote Hilchas. But it's not really. Aninas is the din daraisa, Karbanos, Ma'aser Sheni. There's nothing to do with it. This is a din Rabbanan of Torah mitzvah. Machlokas Rashi and Tosas at the beginning of the third parak. Rashi writes that the reason why he's patam on mitzvah is because it's tircha. He can't focus on the mitzvah. And Tosas goes in the Yerushalmi, it's covered amaze. All good rush. How could you do the mitzvah, in front of the dead person? My nafka community in Rashi and Tosas. According to Rashi, if you can transcend the situation you're in, then maybe you could do it. But according to Tosas, it's usher. We pass like Tosas, it's usher. So Onin's usher to do mitzvahs. He doesn't have an option. Covered amaze. So the question is, so could he go to McDonald's then, or go to Wendy's, or try something he finds enticing? So of course not. He's only pater mi mitzvahs aseh. He's not pater from negative kaveh. That's a shayla I assume as well. There are some shittas that they assume is even pater from los aseh as well. The Rishonim don't like. What do you mean? Then like what makes him different than a guy and stuff? But either way, it's a separate shir. But by the oning, it's clear. No one says it. Oning is pater mi mitzvahs aseh, but he can't violate negative or even isser aseh. So the Piskei Tshuva raises, so what does he do if he's hungry? He wants to eat bread. He doesn't have to fast. So what's the problem? Because there's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan to wash your hands before you eat bread. And there's an issur d'Rabbanan to eat bread without washing, so you're stuck. So the Piskei Tshuva says washes out of bracha. What kind of compromise is that? So the Achronim explain is because out the mitzvahs aseh, it's also for him to do it. So he can't wash out the mitzvahs aseh. But then why is he washing? To avoid the Yisud Rabbanan. So Chazal only instituted brachas when you're doing mitzvahs aseh. To avoid negative commandments, he never instituted a bracha. Hence the compromise, it's not a compromise, that's the halacha. You wash your hands without a bracha because there's no chiyuv bracha. So the shayla is like this: you're an onain. Rachmana, someone dies on Yantif, and so obviously you have the kfura on Chol Hamoed, and you don't start the avelos until after Yantif. So before the kfura on Chol Hamoed, you're an onain. So let's say you want to eat something now, and it's Sukkot, Chol Hamoed Sukkot. So where does an onain eat? Does he eat in his house? Maybe it's an issue chutz l'sukkah. Does he eat in the sukkah? But he can't do a mitzvah. So the minchas, again, the minchas has a chiddush to say there's an issue. Most assume there's not. But what the minchas Chinuch says, an onain should eat in the sukkah without a bracha. Why? Because he's not eating in the sukkah, but the Torah's mitzvah is also to do. But he's doing it to avoid the Isser, so hence no bracha. So that's the shayla here. The minchas, so he says, if we just had the pasuk, if we just had the principle of mitzvah ba'avera, so someone eating in the sukkah, someone eating in a stolen sukkah, he'd be considered eating in the sukkah, but he wouldn't be getting the kiyam mitzvah because it's a mitzvah ba'avera. Comes the pasuk and tell me chag sukkahs taselacha, lahot is exula. It's not even a sukkah. You're eating chutz l'sukkah. So therefore, that'd be enough, whether, let's say in terms of if it only wanted to eat maybe the stolen sukkah. So if you hold it's a sukkah, it's not a no-shame sukkah, you might as well eat in your house already. But but basically what he's saying is mitzvah ba'avera is a psu on the gavra. The sukkah, I can't take away the sukkah, but I don't get my mitzvah. Comes the pasuk chagas sukkah, that it's not even a chefsa of a sukkah. So that's what the Gra is saying in the Bali Tosis here. So what's pshat? He says it's not a machlokas yeshiva sukkah versus achila that Tosis holds from its star. Else why does he have to go back afterwards if it stops raining? No, what is Tosis agrees fundamentally with the rush. You have to eat in the sukkah even in the rain. I guess the way the Gra is already, that's the machlokas Tosis and the rush is. What's pshat yardu grishamim? You can't eat in the sukkah. The Rush seems to be learning it's a pesul gavra. That normally yardu grishamim mitzvah patim in a sukkah, but there is no heter of mitzvah laila rishona, and therefore yardu grishamim still is a sukkah. It's just normally Chazal tell me I can't fulfill my mitzvah in the sukkah like that, but laila rishona Tesvav tells me yes. And apparently Tosis also agrees fundamentally with the Rush. Except that the Gra is saying, he holds that Yardu Gashama makes it always sukkah, and therefore it's very fitting the Gra learns that way because there's a minig among many Chabad and many Hasidus that even when it's rainy, they eat in the sukkah. Again, so even though I'm not going to, that's a separate share in its own right, because the Ramah writes explicitly, one who sits in the sukkah when it's raining, he's a hedjot, he's a fool. Again, it never says it's also to, it says you're a fool. So among the Hasidim they say that, mitzvah patim in a sukkah, so they say it's a bigger star for them to eat inside than eating in the rain in the sukkah. It's a bigger star for them not eating in the sukkah. So they, again, it doesn't say it's also to eat in the sukkah, but that's a minute. I'm not sure how far they take that, etc. If it's all Chabad, but it's interesting. The Vilna Gaon saying that because if you work with he had his issues with the Hasidim, that's why I'm just pointing it out. It could be coincidental, but if it's Yardu Geshamin, so he really thinks, I guess what's the pshat in the Ramah? They're a hedjot. It's the pshat he's saying like the Gra. Yardu Geshamim, like Tosis, that it's not a shame sukkah, so you're a fool for eating out there. That's how, the Ramah seems to be learning. it will lav dafka unless he just holds the mitzvah anyway. But then, but you could say that way, and then for sure you're a hedjot. It's much better if you say the Ram, or if you want to say the Ramah saying you're a hedjot, even if it's not, even if it's din on the gavra, it's better if you say the Ramah saying, so then there's no point in reading in the sukkah. But then maybe it should be, then you're a fool. But perhaps if it's just in the gavra, so maybe if you're not mitzvah, then you get into that. But I'm pointing out that's a point out because that's what the gra. So in terms of the machlokas, so according to the first way, it seems to be a fundamental machlokas tosis on the rush, whether the heter mitzvah applies to Laila Rishona. According to the tosis, yes. Rush, no. According to the gra, no. Even Tosis agrees. No one says there's a heter. I wouldn't say no, but at least Tosis doesn't either. It's only a technical reason why he can't eat the sukkah, because as long as it's yardu gushamim, there's no shame sukkah. So it's a machlokas Tosis is the rush. Allah ma'isa. What do we do? So the Ramah quotes the rush that one should eat in the sukkah even if it's raining, and that's it. He just quotes the rush and pashtus. He doesn't make, perhaps even according to the rush, then you make a leishe bas sukkah, and that's it. According to, if you hold there's no heter mitzvah, so minimally you got to eat your kazayas or whatever, or your kabeya. You eat in the sukkah, you should make a leishe also, according to the rush, and I guess presumably eat it as much as you can of the Suda out there. Because he says Shechayev to eat. So according to the rush, the Ramah just quotes the rush. However, the Mishtabur and other poskim modify the Ramah. They want to say, well, it's not clear that we reject all the other Rishonim either. So first the poskim talk about waiting. If it's raining outside, some say you should wait until midnight, wait a couple of hours. So many Achronim point out that's only maybe if you're eating alone and you're single. But if you have a wife and kids or guests, it's not a good idea to be sitting there waiting there 2 hours until it stops. So unless everyone wants to sit and learn for 2 hours or whatever the case may be. But so Pashas, most people aren't going to. I don't think today people are going to be waiting that long. So therefore, what you do is, so what the poskim say to do is, based on the rush, because they want you to fill all the shitas. According to the rush, you eat in the sukkah, and that's it. But according to the way the poskim say, we're kosher for shitas tosis as well. So with the halach l'maisa, we go in the sukkah, make kiddush, shachiyanu. We no leishe basukkah. You go in, you make hamotzi and eat a kazayas of bread in the sukkah, having in mind to go back in the house, or having in mind to stay in this, or having in mind to go back when the rain stops and finishing your meal up in the sukkah. So that's it. If it doesn't stop raining, that's it. You stay in the house and you're bench in the home, and you're home free. However, if it stops raining, so then they say you should go back out and eat a kabeya of bread. You don't have to make a motzi, it's still part of the meal. You go back out, you eat a kabeya, make a leishe basukah to fulfill shitas tosfos. So in other words, it's like a compromise. So we follow Rush, we follow the shitas harash, but we're also choshesh for shitas tosfos. And therefore, and that's what we do. And then we bench in the sukkah. That's why Ryan asked me an interesting question tonight based on the Sunday share. I don't know if you picked up on it. That he said, because we pointed out that most people switch the order of the brachas on Kiddush. That the first night you do Kiddush, Leishe Basukah Shechiyanu. The second night you do Kiddush, Shechiyanu, then Leishe Basukah. We explained according to the Ran is because the Shechiyanu on the Kedusha Shayom, that has to be done on Yontif. So let's say we're not sure of yesterday, it's Yontif Sheni now. So out Yontif, we don't know if yesterday was Yontif, so you got to make a Shechiyanu on the Kedusha Shayom. But on the Sukkah part, even if it wasn't Sukkah, really we said you can make on the Sukkah a Shechiyanu even before Sukkot. So you could have been Yotze on your Shechiyanu beforehand. So therefore, when you make a Shechiyanu the second night, it's only going on the Kedushas Hayom, and the order would be Kiddush, Shechiyanu, then Leishei Basukah. We switch the order. So Ryan asked an interesting question. What happens on the first night it rains and you don't go back? So according to the Rush, that you have a chiyuv, there is no heter mitzvah. So presumably according to the Rush, the shita would be you'd eat in the sukkah and make a leishev, so there's something to talk about. But and according to Tosfos, then you would not, so according to Tosfos, you definitely would not have fulfilled your mitzvah. The only issue is, do we say, did the Shechiyanu, so according to Tosfos, you clearly didn't fulfill your mitzvah of yeshiva sukkah if it rained all night. So you actually never went in the sukkah. So perhaps, then according to Tosfos, he would say to make the, make the leishev at sukkah first, and then make the shechiyanu. So it seems to be, it comes to be a doubt, a machlokas between Tosfos and the rest. Okay, so if we take the Rama Kipshuto, that he's following the Rashba, the Rush, so then we should switch the order. But we don't necessarily follow the Rush consistently because we don't make a leishev basukah. We don't make a leishev basukah because we're saying Safek Brachos V'Hakel. So then probably I haven't seen I have to check if any of the posts actually say it, but then I would say you might as well say the Shechiyanu at the end, because that's the Rush Shita anyway, and and it's a suffix. The reason why we normally make the Shechiyanu first, we don't want to have any hefsek between. If we don't need the leishev basukah, why put it in before the Shechiyanu? But since it's a sveika dedina, what greater needs? So then I would say you make the leishev basukah, and then you do the Shechiyanu at the end. So that's that seems that's the issue of Laila Rishona. So that's so those are some of the issues of mitzvah, how they relate to Laila Rishona and the Machlokes Rishonim on it. The Torah tells us, "Basukkos teishvu shivas yomim." One shall dwell in the sukkah 7 days, like we're doing right now, dwelling in the sukkah. And teishvu doesn't mean this literally sitting does help. According to some Rishonim, you should be sitting by the bracha leishev basukah. But Chazal interpret teishvu in a much more broader sense, that you should live in the sukkah. As the Gemara tells us, teishvu ke'ein tadiru. You should live in the sukkah like you live in your house all week long. That just like if it's too hot in one room, you move to another room. If it's too cold, you move to a different room. If there's a leak in your house, in your kitchen, you're going to move to your dining room. So too, if it's raining or different types of mitzvah, you're exempt from the sukkah. That's a special dispensation. Mitzvah patur min sukkah. Someone who's under distress, he's exempt. And the classic case is yardu geshamim, is when it's raining. And therefore, whether you should sit in the sukkah while it's raining, the Ramah seems to call you a hedjot. You're a fool for sitting in the sukkah in the rain. Not that it's prohibited. But other types of mitzvah, there'll be an element of a judgment call in terms of what's considered mitzvah, what's not mitzvah, what a person's used to, what's the norms, etc. And in fact, the Gemara even tells us that really sleeping in the sukkah is even stricter than eating in the sukkah. Because for sleeping in the sukkah, even if you take a 30-minute nap, you should do it in the sukkah. But for achilas arai, for temporary eating fruits, we'll say, it's a discussion whether if you're having a whole meal without bread, whether it's preferable to be in the sukkah. But either way, there's certain types of fruits, potato chips, you're just snacking, you're having a drink, so one is not obligated to eat in the sukkah, but if you're sleeping, you are. So why is it that so many more people eat in the sukkah, but they don't sleep in the sukkah? So there are many different leniencies regarding sleeping in the sukkah. Again, people are mitzvah, that the level for sleeping is higher than eating. Like, people could tolerate sitting outside in the cold, or in a little discomfort, or the animals roaming around. But when they're sleeping, they don't feel so comfortable. It could be a safety issue, or as I'm saying, Teishu Kein Tadiro, it's Simchas Yantiv, that the same way you'd celebrate in your home, the same way, that's the way you should spend in the sukkah. So if you're uncomfortable in there as well, if a married couple has an added exemption, since the wife's exempt, so the Magen Avraham writes, maybe you should try to convince your wife to sleep in the sukkah, but if not, then you could be inside with your family, because that's part of Simchas Yantav. It's the sitting in the sukkah with the family. So either way, so that's the halacha, Teishvu Ke'in Tadiro. So it's interesting that we're much more strict by sleeping. In practice, we're much more lenient. But on the book, sleeping is much stricter. In reality, we're much more lenient by sleeping than eating. So the Mishnah usually gives us certain halachas, and we learn out from specific halachas, we learn many things. But once in a while, the Mishnah gives us a couple of stories. The Gemara gives us stories of great rabbis about what they did. And not only can we learn from what they say, we can learn from their actions. That's what's unique about Judaism. If you had different people, you had the president, vice president, Supreme Court members, if they were doing something, smoking Cuban cigars, for instance, which are illegal, you couldn't bring any proof about the law, that the law is not changing. It's illegal. In fact, I think the Greek philosophers used to say, don't follow what I do, follow what I say. In Judaism, it's not the way it works. If you see great rabbis doing things, it's not just a coincidental. That means you could learn your own practices from that. Of course, we have to know who the great rabbis are and who aren't. So the Mishnah tells us the great Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when they were offered fruit or snack foods to eat outside the sukkah, they asked that the food should come into the sukkah, and they ate everything in the sukkah. However, other great rabbi, Rav Tzadok, he elected to eat the fruit inside the home, or not in the sukkah. So, what do we see? Why is the Mishnah telling us this story about the two different rabbis choosing different ways? So perhaps, as I soon one of my friends suggested, Howie Jachter, he's a rabbi in TABC. I read an article from him, and he suggested, I like the interesting explanation, that we know in halacha, there are different levels of halacha. It's what, let's say, Rav Kook calls Torahs Moshe versus Torahs Avraham. Torahs Moshe are the commandments, not the 10 suggestions that some like to think, but the 10 commandments. And then there's Torahs Avraham, the Avos, as we'll be beginning the book of Bereshis next week. We're going to go through, learn Ma'isa Avos Simul Abanim. We're going to learn a lot from the Avos, and we're going to see many things. Did they keep Shabbos? Did they keep this? Whatever they kept was Petoras Eino Mitsuva V'Yoseh. It was voluntary. So we see the different types. There's certain halachas you have to keep, and then there's a Torah of the Avos that we have an option to keep. So obviously eating bread in the sukkah, having a whole meal with bread, so that's not negotiable, unless of course it's raining or you're sick, etc. But all things being equal, you don't have an option. But eating fruit in the sukkah, you do have an option. We see some rabbis chose to eat it in the sukkah, and other rabbis chose not to eat in the sukkah. And that's how halach, people think halach is the maximum. Really, halach is the minimum. And therefore, one gives us the minimum, and then people choose on what they're going to be machmir on, or what they're going to be more strict on, and what not. And there's always the baseline halacha, the core holding, the conventional halacha, and then people have a right to take on more chumras. Like we know there's a mitzvah of Shabbos, that's not negotiable, but Tosefes Shabbos, adding to Shabbos, so different towns, different minhagim, some bring in Shabbos 18 minutes before, some 30, some 5, but whatever it is, there's room with to make your own call. So that's what the Mishnah is coming to teach me. That so they point out that these great rabbis, Rabbi Gamliel, Reb Tzadok, Rabbi Yochanan, all were prominent rabbis during the Churban Bayesheni, during the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. So is there some link perhaps between these? What's the link between eating snacks inside or outside the sukkah and Churban Bayesheni, and the destruction of the second temple. So some of Farshim explain as follows, that we know we had great people, great Talmidei Chacham, and great people during the Churban Bayesheni. But as the Tziv writes, and the Gemara tells us, what was the cause of the destruction of the second temple? Sinas Chinam, unwarranted hatred. People didn't get along with one another. And therefore, what was the mistake? That people were intolerant of other opinions. That either if you didn't believe in what I say, you're a heretic, you're an apikoros. If you don't, it's my way or the highway. We see some people have a problem today with that as well, tolerating other shittas in halacha. And that's what perhaps the Mishnah, the Gemara is coming to tell me, that what was if the cause of Churban Bayesheni, the destruction of the second temple, was sinas china, people not treating other people nicely, how do you rectify that? If people didn't tolerate other, so what do we see? These great rabbis, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Tzadok, they had different opinions whether they should eat the fruit. Everyone agrees you don't have to. Some decided, well, we'll be strict, we'll eat it in the sukkah, others not. And they were able to live in peace and harmony and unity. And that's what it's coming to tell me, that one has to work on the Ben Adam Chavero, one has to learn to respect the other, other opinions. Within the box in Judaism there are many acceptable opinions, and you follow your Rav and you go with that opinion. But the fact someone has a different opinion about something else doesn't make them too firm, too modern, too liberal. Everyone follows their own Rav, and they, whatever they go with, that's as long as it's an acceptable shita, that is fine. You don't have to do the same way you're doing. That's one explanation, the connection between eating snacks and Churban Bayesheni. Perhaps another one is as follows. The Rambam tells us in Shmona Prakim, what's the middle road, the golden path? It's going in the middle road. All extremes are bad. You have to follow the middle road. And therefore he explains, only if you have a sickness, then you have to go to the opposite extreme. So for instance, if the reed is bent all the way to the left and you want to get it back to the middle, so if you just put it back to the middle, it will go back to the left. But if you move it all the way to the right, you have to be careful not to break it, then it will move back to the middle. If you have like someone will say, you know what, this person's sick, they have pneumonia, they have the flu, or they have some type of sickness, disease, and they need antibiotics. So a person says, you know what, this person was sick and they took antibiotic and now they feel much better. So imagine the healthy person saying, I feel great now. Imagine how good I'll feel if I take this antibiotic. No, that's not the way it works. Medicine, you have a certain deficiency, you don't have an appropriate balance, and the medicine gives you the appropriate balance. If you have the appropriate balance, then you don't, if your cholesterol is fine, you're not doing yourself a favor taking those pills or blood pressure or etc. So life is full of balance, and that's what unless you have a sickness, then you have to go to extremes. But if you're healthy, the middle road is the healthy way. And the Rav Salvation explained, doesn't mean on every issue you have to be in the middle of the road. You could be passionate more about some issues, less about others, but your overall being is, at the end of the day, you're someone who's a moderate person. You're taking everything you do. It doesn't mean you can't feel strongly about kosher, Shabbos, or whatever your issues are, Eretz Yisrael, whatever they might be. But as long as overall you have a middle road, so then you're fine. And that's what the pshat is here. We see that who are these rabbis during Churban Bayesheni? Rav Tzadok fasted for a long time, many days, to prevent the Churban Habayis. I forget, 40 days, 40 years, he fasted for a long time in order to try to prevent Churban Bayesheni. On the other hand, Rabbi Gamliel or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not. So we see when it came to try to prevent the Churban Habayis by being strict, Rav Tzadok took on fasting as a very Gamliel didn't. On the other hand, we see when it came to the mitzvah of Sukkah, it was Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who was strict, even eating fruits in the Sukkah. But Rav Tzadok, who fasted, he ate fruits outside. So the point being is, a person's passionate about different things. You don't take on every chumrah, or you don't take on every kula. In fact, that's the Gemara in Erev. One who, well, we know, discusses the machlokes Beis Hillel by Shammai, who you follow. Today we have different rules, but during the time of the Gemara, so they say whoever you want to follow, either follow Beis Hillel or follow Beis Shammai, but you can't take the kulas, the chumras of each. One who takes the leniencies of each, then you're a rasha, you're a wicked person. But one who, but big deal, let me take all the stringencies, I'll take all the chumras. Rabbi Yochanan was very strict when it came to sukkah, even a fruit they eat outside, yet they weren't fasting over to prevent churban by Yesheni. Yet Rav Tzadok, who was very passionate about fasting, yet he ate inside. And that's what we say, you either follow whoever, in that case, Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, you don't take the kulas and chumras, you take, you go with the consensus view, or you have a Rabbi you follow, whether it's Mekel, whether it's lenient or Machmer. And we see the importance of balance in another halacha. We know we have the four meanings, the four species, the lulav, the estrog, the hadassim, the myrtles, and the arabas and the willows. So the halacha is that you need a hadassim mishulashim. You need hadassim to be kosher. There have to be three coming from the same level, the same branch. Today it's much easier. It's the pro and con of modern society. They come with hashgacha, many of them. They come in the plastic. You take them out, so it's very good. At least you have kosher ones, or you hope that at least they went in kosher. On the other hand, you lose that father, son, that Rebbe, Talmud, that connection. You go into Eretz Yisrael or even Borough Park, you see people spending time, people spending hours looking over an estrog and a lulav. In terms of that, chinuch, the impact that has on a child, whether it's the same thing for shalach manas, when people just send one package, so it's good for the convenience, but in terms of the chinuch part is lacking. But overall, probably it's better that we have the ability at least to have kosher hadassim so people fulfill the mitzvah. So you need a hadassim mishulashim, and if they are in hadassim mishulashim, the Gemara calls it a hadas shoteh, a psychotic hadas, an unhealthy hadas. There's something wrong, and in fact, it's very strong because by the other psulim we have on Sukkot, let's say if the pitam falls off. So many of the halachas only apply to the first day, but perhaps for the second day, even if your pitam falls off, it's still okay, and other types of leniencies. Yet when it comes to a hadas, the Rambam says it applies to all Shiva. It applies to all 7 days of Sukkot. Why by a hadas we're so strict with the hadas shoteh? Because as Rav Selevan explained, because what do you mean psychotic hadas? Because part of life is balance. One has to be balanced in life. And if you don't have all three coming out of the same level, you're not even a hadas anymore. In fact, a katan, someone under 13, a girl under 12, they're considered a katan or katana. In halacha, they're almost treated like a shoteh. Why? They're not like a halachic fool, because we all know, we see it and hopefully it remains when you're a kid. Unfortunately, you see it among many adults today. But when a kid gets very upset, they start crying, it's total sadness. They don't realize what happened 5 minutes ago, what happened an hour ago. All they know is they lost their toy now. Someone stole their lollipop, and it's total sadness. And conversely, when they're happy, it's total happiness. That's a child, because they have no balance. For an adult, it's not supposed to be there. Even when you're very happy, you have to know, don't get carried away emotionally. Have a balance. There's still some sadness. That could be the ending of a wedding, of the churban habayis. We break the glass at the wedding to keep the balance. And on the reverse case, that's why we read Kohelet today, because not to get carried away with the simcha, we read Kohelet to give us a perspective on life. So a child has no balance. Unfortunately, some adults don't have balance. But the point is, they get too carried away with things. And that's why it's a hadas shoteh, because you can't function in life if you're a shoteh, if you don't have a healthy balance in terms of everything. And that's what And that's what we learn out from the rabbis. And in fact, that's why we know there's a famous machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. Why do we sit in the sukkah? Is it because of the clouds of glory? So if it's the clouds of glory, we understand why we have a Yantif. But if it's a sukkah's mamish, what do we celebrate? Sitting out in the sukkah? But that's what the rabbis tell us, that by sukkah's teshu, should you return to the sukkah, is because right after, we know, especially in this society, we're always looking forward. We can't appreciate anything. I got this degree, I got that. Okay, now what's next? I accomplished this. Let's move on. That's good. But there's another negative of you don't go back ever, take a step back and look at all your accomplishments, where a person has come. That's what Sukkot is all about. We just went through, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and now we're about to begin the new year. We've begun the new year technically, but we're getting Sefer Bereshis. You have to get a week away from it all and get your priorities straight. The famous story with the Chafetz Chaim, that someone came to visit him and they were expecting a big mansion, and they walked in, the guy had chutzpah and said, "Where's all your furniture?" to the Chafetz Chaim. So the Chafetz Chaim said, "Where's your furniture?" So the guy said, "Well, I don't live here. You want to come to my house? I'll show you my granite kitchen, my double ovens, my oak and everything." So the Chafetz Chaim said, I'm traveling also. I'm also only on a journey. And obviously, if you're only on a journey, obviously in the sukkah you can't take everything with you. You need priority. Sukkah is the time to go back and get your priorities straight. What's important in life, your family, your learning, your davening, whatever else is important in one's life. You can't take everything in the sukkah. Sukkah is the time to reevaluate where you're going in life. And in fact, that's what the story with the university professor who was teaching a time management class. And he brought in a big box, and he brought in some big rocks, and he filled up the box with the rocks, and they asked the class, "Is the box full?" Of course they fell for it. He said, "Yeah, it's full." He said, "No, it's not." He went underneath and took some pebbles and filled up the pebbles along the rocks. He says, "Are they full now?" Well, some said yes, some said no. He said no, and he came and he took sand and he poured sand in the box. He said, "Is it full now?" But then no one wanted to say anything, and he came and no, it's not. He took water and he filled it up. He said, "Now it is full." What's the lesson? So one of the students said, "Well, life's so busy, you got to find time to do the stuff in the middle of the cracks." But that wasn't the lesson he was getting. The lesson is in life, the lesson of the sukkah. You have to learn to prioritize, because if you don't put the big rocks, i.e. the most important things are the big rocks, the pebbles are the less important things. If you start filling up the box with the pebbles and the sand, you're not going to have room for the big rocks. If you waste your time, or you spend your time on the non-essentials, when it comes to the essentials, there's not going to be room. And that's what sukkah is. By sukkah is teshvu. And it's from the word tshuva, tashuvu. It's an extension of the yamim noraim. It's a time to go in. As we mentioned, that on sukkah, not only do we have the water libations, we normally have the wine libations. Why do we have the water libations? Because as we see it on TV all the time, that someone after an earthquake, a tornado, a hurricane, after a natural disaster, anything, everything gets washed away. But they're there, just the family, and they're alive, and we're so happy to be alive. It's not so important, all the other material things. We all lived through a life and death situation called Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We're all judged on life and death. And now Sukkot is all we need. We don't need the wine to get us going. It's enough with the water. The things we have in common with the animals. The fact I woke up this morning, I'm alive. Ezo Ashir Hasameach Bechelko. The one who's wealthy, the one who's happy with the lot. Ashir, Ayin, Einayim, someone who has eyes. Shinayim, teeth, the mouth. Yodayim, Raglayim, hands and feet. That's the Ashir, the one who has health. You could have all the money in the world. It doesn't do much good if you don't have any health. You can't appreciate life. That's what Sukkot is all about. You know what we're telling me? The Sukkot's mamish. This keeps us going. During the week, we have one day, we have Shabbos for perspective. But now to get us going now, we need a week to spend in the Sukkah. in Sukkot, in a temporary dwelling, a diras arai, to appreciate all the things we have, so we can learn to appreciate the things in life. And as we all know, the power of contrast. That's why by Pesach we know the Rav and Shmuel, Matchel v'Genus, we begin with shame of the Jewish people and end with praise. So if it's the time of the Exodus from Egypt, let's get to the good stuff. Why wasting our time with the shame? Because to fully appreciate the freedom, you got to know what being a slave is. I appreciate eyesight as much as I can, but someone who was once blind, now they could see. It's a totally different appreciation. I only have an intellectual one, but one to experience. That's what Sukkah is, to experience the diras arai. And the Sukkah, we're not protected from the animals, the winds, the rain, and things we take for granted all the time. We live in a home, we have protection. That's what the Sukkah is. That's what we remember the Sukkah is mamish. And to summarize, that's the lessons we learn from these great rabbis. Either we learn the midah of toleration. It doesn't have to be my way or the highway. That there are many different level halachic acceptable ways. You find your own Rabbi, your own mentor, and you go with the Rabbi, you go with the rove. Or the lesson of balance, that you don't take every kul and every chumrah. You need a balance, a shvil hazav. It's the middle golden path. And it doesn't have to be over every issue. Some things you'll be more passionate about. Rav Tzadok fasted, but he ate in fruit outside the sukkah, etc. And that's what's unique about Judaism. Other religions is you can't learn out from what other people do. In fact, the Greek philosophers used to say, don't do what I say, do what I say, don't do what I do. But we know when it comes to Judaism, we see what the great rabbis do, and the fact that if Rav Tzadok was eating fruits outside the sukkah, we know that's an acceptable view. If this rabbi was eating this type of food, then we know it's okay. And those are some of the lessons we learn from the mitzvah of sukkah. So the Torah tells us, "Basukkos teishvu Shivas Yamim." There's a mitzvah to dwell in the sukkah for 7 days. And the Torah, when he brings down the halacha, Torah is a halacha sefer. There's the Torah Shulchan Aruch, and then later the regular, we know it's a Shulchan Aruch, so he's a halachic sefer. Usually just brings down halacha l'maisa. He doesn't go into stories and other things. That's not the purpose of the sefer. So it's interesting to know when the Torah brings down the halachas of Sukkah, he starts going to historical background. He gets into a machlokas, a famous machlokas that is, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, what is the nature of the mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah? Why do we sit in the Sukkah? Is it Sukkah's mamish, like Rabbi Akiva? We actually built tents every night, every Sukkah, and they took it down? Or no, it was anei covered. So the Bach, one of the commentators on the Torah, another Mefarshim, asked on the Torah, who cares? My nafkamina, your halacha sefer, why are you going into details of the nature? It's nice to understand the philosophy of the mitzvah and the history, but it's not the place here. Why does the Torah go out of his normal derech of not just giving the straight halacha? Why is he going into this seemingly, it's an interesting, nice discussion, machshava, hashkafa, but halacha l'maisa, well, I don't care why. I don't need the whole machlokas. Just tell me what to do, and that's the end of it. So that's what the Bach explains among the Bikurai Yaakov, many Achronim, is there's a general halacha we have in Kol HaTorah Kulo, in the whole Torah, mitzvahs, or it's a machlokas actually, whether mitzvahs strichas kavana. Do mitzvahs require intent? One opinion in the Gemara says yes. Another opinion says no. And of course I always point out this is a post facto machlokas. No one says you're about to put on your talis and tefillin now, don't have kavana. That's not a shita. The question is, if I put on my talis, put on my tefillin without the requisite kavana, do I have to go back and redo it, make another bracha? So that's a machlokas in the Gemara, a apparent contradiction in the Rambam, etc. So the way the Magen Avraham paskins and the way we assume la halacha is on a mitzvah min Torah we paskin mitzvah strichas kavana. On a biblical mitzvah we say kavana is essential. On a rabbinical mitzvah we say you should have the kavanah, but if you don't, and you already did the mitzvah, you do not have to go back. By the way, the Vilna Gaon disagrees and says even on a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, you have to go back. But we assume that's how the Machaba Paskins in Hilchas Kriya Shema, on a mitzvah min Torah, he actually brings down the halacha of mitzvah. So there's a general halacha of mitzvah, knowing it's a mitzvah. Because again, as I point out, even if you hold mitzvah strichas kavana, or I should say, even if you hold mitzvahs don't need kavana, you still have to know you're doing a mitzvah. If you never heard of sukkahs in your life, you don't even know you're sitting in a sukkah, you think you're outside in a summer hut, you wouldn't get the mitzvah either. You have to be aware minimally that there's a mitzvah, and you're involved in some kind of mitzvah. So that's a general machlokas by Kol HaTorah Kul. By a mitzvah min Torah like sukkah, we assume you have to have the kavanah. But comes along the Bach and the Bikuri Yaakov, the Aruch HaNer, and say, by sukkahs, in addition to the normal mitzvah strichas kavanah, there's a secondary kavanah that also one needs. And that's the kavanah, as the Torah tells, L'man yedu doresecha ki b'sukkah so shafti, that the Bach brings down, in addition to having the regular, I know I'm involved in a mitzvah, it's not enough by sukkah. By sukkah, I have to realize, why am I sitting in the sukkah? I'm sitting in the sukkah because of the 40 years that the Jews traveled in the Midbar from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael, the whole time in the Midbar. I need the additional kavanah. In fact, he brings down, there are two other mitzvahs as well. Ironically, I just spoke about them, talis and tefillin. In addition to the regular mitzvahs, because kavanah, the Torah tells us, Uman Tizkuru, the Torah tells you have to remember all the mitzvahs when you look at your tchelas, you look at your tzitzis, or tefillah, Uman Tiyah, Torah Hashem Beficha. He says that by talis, tefillin, and sukkah, in addition to the normal kavanah of mitzvah strichas kavanah, we need an additional element. And in fact, and the Bikuri Yaakov goes so far as to say, this kavanah is likuva. This kavanah is an obstacle in performing. If you don't have this extra kavanah, you don't fulfill your mitzvah. In fact, that's why the Bach says, that's what the Torah is getting at here. Why is the Torah going into something he usually doesn't do? He seems to be going into the history, the makshava, goes into the whole machlokas, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Kiva. By the way, and why is he pasking on this machlokas? So he says we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer Adonai HaKavod. So the Torah is saying when you sit in the sukkah, one should have the kavanah of the Adonai HaKavod, the clouds of glory that protected us for those 40 years. In fact, it's a big chiddush of the Bach, of the Aruch HaNer, because we do have a klal in general in the Gemara. It's the famous machlokas Rav Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, in a different context, which ties into here, is the question of darshina and time at the kra. In general, when we have a reason for a mitzvah, is the reason built into the mitzvah not? In other words, it's a machlokas. The Gemara talks about it about a mitzvah. It's a Mishnah. The Torah tells us you can't take, when you lend something to a widow, an almana, you can't take collateral. So presumably, why not? Because the widow, she has no one supporting her. She doesn't have any money. It might be her last coat. It might be her only pillow. So therefore, you can't take a collateral from a widow, because the assumption is because that might be the only thing she has. So there's an interesting machlokas in the Gemara between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon. What about a wealthy widow? Someone who's independently wealthy, she had a nice life insurance policy, whatever the case may be, she has a lot of money. So the question is, and you lend her something, you got to take collateral. So Rabbi Yehuda says no. Eino darshina and time at the kra. I can't go into the reasons and try to figure out the halacha. The reason can't come and mitigate and limit the scope of the mitzvah. That's it. The Torah says not to take collateral. That's all I know. No cheshbonos, and that's it. And Rav Shimon says no. Darshina and time at the kra. Of course, you can take the reason for the mitzvah and figure it out. And what's the whole reason why you can't take collateral? Is because she doesn't have any money. In a situation where she's a wealthy widow, so it's not an issue. In fact, it's Rav Shimon, interesting Rav Shimon L'shitason, that there's an interesting Rav Menachem Zemba later on in, I think it's Parshas Vayishlach, around there, when it talks about halacha v'yadua, she'esav sonei es Yaakov. There's a halacha, it's a strange language when Rashi is explaining the hatred between Esav and Yaakov. He doesn't say derech ha'olam. He says halacha v'yadua, which is an expression of a halacha Moshe misinai. It's a halacha Moshe misinai that Esav hates Yaakov. Like, what kind of language is that? So who's talking? It's Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon is usually darshin in time with the Christ, and you can usually figure out why they hate the Jews. They have too much money, they don't have enough money, they run the world, they don't run the world. When it comes to anti-Semitism, even Rav Shimon agrees, don't waste your time being darshin in time with the Kra, because there is no reason. That's a separate discussion. So either way, Rav Shimon writes, so comes along the Gemara in Sanhedrin and says, but wait a second, Rabbi Yehuda, when it comes to a king marrying many wives, even though the Torah says not to, Rabbi Yehuda says you can marry many wives. So what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? Does he hold darshin in time in the Quran? Not. So the Gemara basically says is, when the Torah gives the reason why a king can't have many wives, what's the concern? The Torah says because they might lead him astray. They might take him away from the Torah. If you marry many firm wives, many wives that will get you closer to God, then that's okay. So what's the klal? So the bottom line is, from the Gemara and the Rishonim Acharonim, right, the klal according to Rabbi Yehuda is, if normally we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, Eino Darshina and time at the Kra. We generally, as a rule, paskin, we can't take the reason and limit the scope or expand the scope of the mitzvah. However, there's one exception to that rule. If the Torah itself gives me the reason for the mitzvah, then I can darshin and time at the Kra. So in the case of the king, the Torah gave me the reason. So if I see the reason doesn't apply, so then I could have many wives. So that's what. So we have that by Yisurim over there by Rabbi Yehuda. So comes along the Bach and others, and they extend it here to Sukkah. That why is Sukkah different? The why is Talis and Tzitzis different? We'll focus on Sukkah. Why is Sukkah different? Because the Torah tells me, L'man yedu dorisech, and the Torah itself is giving me the reason for the mitzvah of Sukkah. Because the Torah itself is giving me the reason of Sukkah. It's not enough mitzvah srichas kavana, but you have to have that special reason that the Torah gives me. The reason why, you have to know exactly why you're sitting in the sukkah. You're sitting in the sukkah because we traveled in the desert 40 years. And either according, it can't hurt to have both kavanas, but according to Rabbi Akiva, sukkah's mamish, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, anei hakavad. So we assume, so some assume, that's even b'di'evet. If you don't have this kavana, that's it. You're not yotze your mitzvah of sukkah. We don't go that far. We assume l'chatchila, it's a nice kavanah to have, and why not? You should have it, but if you don't have it, you still fulfill your mitzvah min Torah of Sukkah. And in fact, the post can even take this even further. They point out, we know there's a concept of a mitzvah aseh, a positive commandment, Sukkah, tefillin, etc., matzah, and then there's a concept in halacha, not necessarily a lav, a negative commandment, which there is, but it's called an isser aseh, that it's formulated in negative, that the aseh is formulated not to do it, but it's not something which is punishable by makis. If you violate a negative commandment, so you get makis, a good old-fashioned whooping. But there's something called an isser aseh, which is it's no onesh. It's kind of like when you don't put on tefillin, you're mevatel mitzvah aseh. But we'll see, there's certain things where the Torah formulates it in the negative, but it's a positive mitzvah, make sure you have to do it. So there's a whole discussion, it's the famous Minchas Chinuch in the mitzvah of Sukkah. He goes into, it is based on the Gemara, everyone agrees there's a mitzvah aseh to sit in the Sukkah. And if you sit in the Sukkah, you get a mitzvah min Torah. And even though women are exempt, the Gemara, based on our Ezra, though, women are exempt from sitting in the sukkah. It's a mitzvah aseh shazman grama. That's a whole shiur why women are exempt. Why don't we compare it to matzah? But it's a mitzvah aseh. So bottom line, they're exempt. But if a woman does sit in the sukkah, she gets a mitzvah min Torah as well. So that's clear. The question the Minchas Chinuch raises: what happens if you don't sit in the sukkah? So you clearly mevatel a mitzvah aseh. You failure to perform a positive commandment. But what about, have you violated any negative commandment? Is there an isser aseh, what he calls, is there a negative commandment, not in terms of makis, but doing something wrong by eating outside the sukkah? So in fact, he discusses it in a halacha l'maisa scenario. Let's say someone, Rachmana, was an onain today. An onain is someone who lost one of the 7 relatives, and the funeral will be today. Someone dies over Yantif, someone dies over Chol Hamoed. So again, it's midin haGemara. You can do kvura to a non-Jew on even the first day of Yantif. The midin haGemara, you could do kvura al Yidei Yisrael on the second day. In fact, certain places among the Hasidim they still do, and Breyers in Washington Heights, the Yekis also do kvura on Yantif, because mikir din haGemara, you should do it. Ramosha has a tshuva on it that in America, in Canada as well, I assume, it's best not to, because it's going to, only certain people are allowed to be involved in the kvura, and if you open it up, you'll cause a lot of chilul yantif. So better to have the kvura on Chol, which we do. Yeah.
Just a quick thought. I think women have to eat matzah because it's pikuei nefesh. They eat the matzah.
Nefesh.
They eat the matzah.
It's pikuei nefesh to eat matzah. You mean?
Yeah, because they remember this is the freedom, this is their life. If they don't eat the matzah, they're going to be slaves. But the din of Sukkot is just to remember. And what does a woman ever forget?
Oh, so just on the side. Okay, yeah. But that's not the reason why we eat matzah. But okay. So they point out that. So that's what the Minchas China points out here. So what about onain? The halacha is by an onain, he's exempt from mitzvahs. The beginning of the third parak in Brachas, Misha Meisu Mutu Lafanav. If you have a mitzvah kfur in front of you, so therefore you're exempt. So you're exempt from it. According to Rashi, because it's tiered to the mitzvah. Your focus is on the kfura. You make sure you focus on the kfura, not on anything else. And Tosfos goes to Yerushalmi, it's covered ames. It's honor to the dead. Lolig l'rush. Like, how could you do mitzvahs in front of a dead person? We paskin like Tosfos. It's usher. According to Rashi, you have the option if you could rise above your situation. We paskin like Tosfos. It's usher to do mitzvahs if you're an onain. So the question is, so it's usher for an onain to do positive mitzvahs. Is he allowed to do negative commandments? Can he go to the McDonald's and have his lunch? So of course not. He's only exempt from mitzvahs aseh, but he can't do negative commandments. So the question is, what does he do while he's an onain? The kvura is going to be at 11 o'clock today. But he wants to eat breakfast, so he doesn't have to fast. It's yantif. So where does he eat his meal? Does he eat his meal in the sukkah or outside the sukkah? Because if there's a mitzvahs aseh, so it's us for him to do mitzvahs aseh. But according to the Minchas Chinuch, there might be an isser to eat chutz sukkah. So according to the Minchas Chinuch, the onain would have to eat inside the sukkah, but no bracha. Why no bracha? Because that's the general klal, like the Piskei Tshuva writes. So if an onain's nothing to do with sukkah, if an onain's eating bread, so what does he do about washing his hands? Because it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan to wash your hands before you eat, and it's an issur d'Rabbanan to eat bread without washing your hands. So the Piskei Tshuva says wash your hands without a bracha. What kind of compromise? It's not a compromise, that's the halacha. Out the mitzvahs aseh, he's exempt, so he doesn't do it. The only reason he's doing the mitzvah is to avoid the issur. Anytime you do something to avoid a prohibition, you never make a bracha. So therefore, the onain would sit in the sukkah without a bracha. So that's what the achronim raise here. What would be someone who eats in the sukkah? Forget about an onain. A regular person who eats in the sukkah without the requisite kavana. Is that the same thing as the halakha? We know there's halakha by tzitzis. The one who's wearing a four-cornered garment has to put tzitzis on it. And if you walk around with a four-cornered garment with no tzitzis, you're mevatel mitzvahs aseh. And perhaps there's also an isser of walking around on a four-cornered, an isser aseh, walking around with a four-cornered garment without putting tzitzis. So some achronim raise, perhaps sitting in the sukkah without this requisite kavana, lo man yedu dorisechem, you violate it. Not only don't you get the mitzvahs aseh of sukkah, but perhaps you're like wearing a four-cornered garment and not putting tzitzis on it. So that's how Shlomo Zalman, the Mikrei Kodesh, so they have a discussion. Halacha ma'isa, we don't go, but that's how far the achronim take it. That you might be considered sitting chutz sukkah if you don't have the requisite kavana. So that's why the Torah. Yeah.
You said that we paskin that mitzvahs d'oraisa ain't tzrichas kavana, but then you said that
the mitzvah d'oraisa we paskin tzrichas kavana.
Tzrichas kavana. Yeah. You said that we paskin that they are tzrichas kavana, and then you said that if you don't have kavana l'maisa on sukkah, then you're still yotze. So why is that?
All right, it's a good question. So within that klal of mitzvah tzrichas kavana, so the poskim right when it comes to sukkah, when it comes to lulav, is that's the Rabbeinu Yonah in the Gemara is in Daf Yud Aleph, but the Rabbeinu in the first parak of brachas. The Gemara talks about the case of mitzvah speakers kavanah. So let's say I pick up a cup. It's not glass. I can't see through it. I think it's a cup of wine. So therefore, I'm about to make a bor. I say Baruch Atah Hashem Kelim Melech. I'm about to make a bor pri agafen, and then I look and I see it's Coke. So I want to know: can I finish off Shakol Niyeh Bidvaro, or do I have to start from the beginning again? That's the Gemara has a whole discussion. Do we go bus or ikr? Do you go by the beginning of the bracha? Do you go by the end? The Gemara leaves it a ibai v'lo ipshite. The Gemara leaves it as a suffix. So we showed him right. Depends on a mitzvah daraisa was strict. On a mitzvah d'Rabbanan we're lenient. So Tosas
that you obviously have the wrong kavana if you're about to say it on the board.
No, Rabbi. The question is here is
I know the substance is also wrong.
No, but here because here it's the same bracha. Up until Melech HaOlam, I haven't made a mistake.
No, but that's not the point. It's a kavana.
No, right. That's correct. That's the issue. Yeah. The issue is what's the important kavana? The end of the bracha, then you'd be okay, or the beginning, right? So Tosas says, but mitzvah we pass mitzvah ain't strichas kavana. So what's the Gemara draying about? So he gives his answer. But Rabbeinu Yonah says, no, even though we paskin on a mitzvah min Torah, mitzvah speaks kavana, but we all know actions speak louder than words. So when do we say it's no good, even likuva, if it's a passive mitzvah? But in a mitzvah which involves a maisa, I'm shaking the lulav, like why else am I cleaning the roof? Why else am I doing it? The action proves that I know, even though I might have spaced out for a couple of minutes, I don't have to actually be thinking it that second. As long as I know why I have the lulav in front of me, oh yeah, it's Sukkot today, that's okay. Or let's say matzah. On a mitzvah, which is the Einbo Maisa, then we go with, so that's the distinction by Sukkah, we're doing an action, we're sitting in the Sukkah. Why else would I be sitting outside in the rain, but why am I sitting outside in this weather? Sometimes it's not as clear when it's a Sukkah, when it's a nice day, but that's what the Rishonim make a distinction. A mitzvah sheyesh bo Maisa, so the Maisa itself shows the Kavanah. Actions speak louder than words. And that's what they point out, you need the special Kavanah. And that's what they point is the machlokes, as we mentioned, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Akiva, on what's the nature of the mitzvah of sukkah, whether it's sukkah's mamash anay akava. So the famous kasha they ask on the tour, it's a very why tour. Yes, why are we celebrating now in the spring? Well, no, why are we celebrating in the fall? If we're celebrating the anay hakava, the sukkah's mamish, last I checked, we left Mitzrayim in the spring. So right after Pesach, we should have another holiday called Sukkot, and we should be building the Sukkot then. So why are we doing it now? Why a delayed mitzvah? So the Torah says, because you know why? Because if we built Sukkot in the springtime, it wouldn't be recognizable we're doing a mitzvah. Everyone builds spring huts and summer huts. So big deal. In the spring, everyone comes out and starts going out in the patio, building the little tent. So it wouldn't be recognizable. I'm doing a mitzvah. Hence, the Torah moved it to the fall. So that's obviously it's a very difficult tour. It's very difficult. Really, I should do the mitzvah in the spring, but because what other people are thinking, therefore I'm going to do the mitzvah in the wrong time. So it's a very difficult tour. Hence, the Vilna Gaon says it's not the pshat. That's not what the Torah is saying. It's much more than that. That's the famous Vilna Gaon. They really know. Of course, we have to celebrate the holiday in the right time. We don't take into Mayomru Hagayim with, well, you know what? Because someone might get the wrong impression. So educate them. That's what, you have all these schools today, all these kirog, so educate someone. Sukkot happens now. That's not a good reason. So the Vilna Gaon says, it's not the Ananei HaKava we're talking about, which would be very nogea to what we're saying, what kavana you have to have for the Ananei HaKavod. Because the Vilna Gaon says what happened was, and everyone agrees to this anyway, that we had the Cheder Egel and the Jewish people lost the divine presence, the Shechina. It wasn't until after Yom Kippur we got the Luchos Shniyos, that God forgave us for the sin of the Cheder Egel, and he figures out it was Tesvav Tishrei, the 15th of Tishrei, which is Sukkot, that we started building Hakamas HaMishkan, the building of the Mishkan, which is the Yontiv of Sukkot. So you know what the Ananei HaKavod is? It's not the Alei HaKavod we're talking about that we traveled 40 years in the Midbar. It's the Alei HaKavod, the cloud of, it's the divine presence that left us after the Cheder Ego, and that returned on Tezvav of Tishrei. That's what we have to have in mind when we sit in the Sukkah. And in fact, that's the Pshat in Davening. We're about to say in Musaf that the different things are Hafta Osanu, Ata Bachar Banu Mika'ami, you chose us among the nations, Hafta Osanu, V'ratzisa Banu. So the Gra says, it's an allusion to the Shalosh Regolim, that God chose us, that's Mitzrayim, that's Jews, He took the Jews out of Egypt. Hafta Osanu, that's us. He gave us the Torah in Har Sinai. What's the Ratzisa Banu? He wants us. So Ritzavita was the word Ritzoi, that the different levels of forgiveness. There's a type of forgiveness where a person does something wrong to you. He says, I never forget, but I'll forgive you. In other words, we're never going to get back our relationship, but don't worry about it. I forgave you. I said Tefillah Zakah on Erev Yom Kippur, or after at night. I forgave you. I really don't forgive you, but I'll forgive you. I'll forgive you for what you did. And that's what Rabbeinu Bachya writes by Yosef and the brothers. He never really forgave them. But there's a much higher level that's called Ritzoi. Ritzoi is not only do I forgive you, but I get back to the way I was even before the sin. In fact, the Meshach Chochmah writes, what we're going to say, at least in Ashkenaz, Chemla Gedora B'Seira, we say Rabba Rabba, not only do we get back, but we even became closer after when God forgave us for the Cheder Ego. Like the shul burns down. When you rebuild it, you even have a nicer shul. That even after the Cheder Ego, not only is it Ritzoi, but it's Chemla Gedora B'Seira, and that's the Vilna Gaon writes. Sukkot is a Ritzoi. We got back to Hakamash HaMishkan. We got back, and therefore God not only forgave us, but we even got back to Kodem Cheder Ego.